I've been plowing some pretty deep furrows with this whole idea of what we would today call civil disobedience. How, when you are unable to honor what you understand to be God's design, God's will, God's law, because you have been given an edict or a command from the civil authorities over you, how do you draw the line where you could and maybe even should disobey the laws of man when they are in conflict with the laws of God? Seems like it should be easy to offer an answer to that, but it is way not easy, and I've pretty much demonstrated that for the last two or three times we've gotten together. I talked about Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego as a good model for appealing to authority and offering an alternative. This is a very smart thing to do when it's possible, but there are times when it simply is not possible to do that. I offered the example of Martin Luther, where he had tried to offer an alternative to the authorities, and they were uninterested. So in 1517, on All Hallows Eve, he nailed 95 theses, 95 objective statements. may have not been quite so objective because they were all accusations against the Catholic Church for breaches of God's design. And then I talked about Martin Luther King Jr. and the civil rights movement. I believe that what was achieved through the civil rights movement was noble and good. I was alive during that period of time. I was just a kid, but I do remember the tremendous angst, the division and the divisiveness, where lines were drawn, sides were chosen, and it was an ugly time. I remember when Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated in Memphis, Tennessee, and how there were people who rejoiced at that. There were others who were deeply saddened by it. I mentioned this to you already, but this year on Martin Luther King Jr.'s birthday, January 19th, I called up from on my smartphone Martin Luther King Jr.'s letter from Birmingham jail. It was awesome. I think I'm going to read it every year, at least, as a reminder of a articulate, intelligent, God-fearing, God-loving leader who wanted to restore justice for all people. Well, it'd be easy for me to get sidetracked and go down a lot of rabbit trails on that. What do you do? What would you do when there's a judgment call that's required for, do I obey this authority of government or do I obey God? Well, there are two other examples that I thought of when I was reflecting on this. One comes from the book of Esther. Esther's an interesting book in many regards. One of the things about Esther that I think is interesting is that it never once mentions God, but his presence is assumed all the way through the story. Esther had an uncle who had raised her, Uncle Mordecai. He performed an act of civil disobedience. There was a ruler who was just a little down the pecking order, but far enough up on the pecking order that he was supposed to be honored and revered. His name was Haman. Mordecai, sitting at the gate, as Haman passed by with his retinue, the policy was that you were to bow and you were to acknowledge his presence. Mordecai did neither. He stood straight. He did not bow. He did not even acknowledge this ruler who was, oh, by the way, an egomaniac and maniacal. He was a bad man. Mordecai stood in silent protest against Haman's, I think, just his character, his evil. And it created no small problem, because when Haman saw this, he knew that was Mordecai, and he knew Mordecai was a Jew. And if you've read the whole book of Esther, you know that Mordecai, without meaning to, kicked over the first domino in a series of events that could have obliterated the Jewish people. But God intervened, and Esther stepped up to the plate, and the end of the story is much different than Haman had planned. Well, my point is, Mordecai did an act of civil disobedience, but he did not expect for it to cost him nothing. There's a second story in the New Testament that I thought of. This was about Peter and John and the disciples in the very earliest days of the church. Peter and John had been preaching. They were hauled in by the Sanhedrin, by the Jewish leaders. They were rebuked soundly for preaching in Jesus' name, and they were told to not do that again. And Peter spoke up and he said, "You judge for yourselves. Should we obey God or man?" And then they obeyed God. When they were dismissed, they went back out and preached. But it was not free. The disciples who preached the gospel of Jesus against the orders of the Sanhedrin, and these were, in a sense, these are not the same as the Roman authorities, but they were the Jewish authorities. And the example of Peter and John and the rest of the apostles was that they chose to obey God, knowing that there would be a cost. And for them, it amounted to they were beaten, they were scourged, they were whipped. There was a cost to their civil disobedience. I'm not saying that if it doesn't cost you, it doesn't count. That's not what I'm saying. But I am saying that in our culture, where we enjoy a First Amendment right that says, in addition to the freedom of the press, in addition to us being able to voice our opinion, we are permitted to gather peacefully. That is the amendment that makes a peaceful protest march possible. This civil disobedience that I'm talking about is a matter of choosing to obey God rather than man. I think there are some times when it seems cut and dry to some people, and it may not seem that way to others. There are a number of issues that are, big in the news and big in our national profile right now, that there's considerable debate about what is the wisest, smartest, most godly response. I do not believe that civil disobedience is always right, and I do not believe that it's always wrong, but I don't think right and wrong move around. Civil disobedience is right when a law of man conflicts, breaks with, stands above, or attempts to stand above a law of God. When I am faced with that choice, do I obey God or do I obey earthly authorities? I've got to always choose God. And when I do that, I have to be willing to pay the price. Okay. that's more than you wanted to hear about it. But now we've got to pick it up in verse 19 where Peter writes, "For it is commendable if someone bears up under the pain of unjust suffering because they are conscious of God." In other words, when you obey God and you are punished for that, or when you are being punished unjustly, although you were not wrong, you didn't do a wrong, and yet you were punished. Peter writes, it's commendable if somebody bears up under the pain of that kind of unjust suffering, because, and this is a very important motivational piece, because their motivation was they are conscious of God, meaning their desire is to honor God, that they would obey God, not men. Interesting that it would be Peter who wrote this, that the Holy Spirit used as his instrument to write this, when this is isn't this exactly what he had told the Jewish leaders? You judge for yourselves whether it is right for us to obey God or man. And then in verse 20, he goes on with the other side of the coin. But how is it to your credit if you receive a beating for doing wrong and endure it? But if you suffer for doing good and you endure it, this is commendable before God. In other words, you know what? If you have to pay a penalty for breaking a law because you're a lawbreaker, that's one thing. If you have this punishment because of doing wrong, so how's that to your credit? Peter asks. On the other hand, if you suffer for doing good and you endure it, this is commendable before God. I have to be careful. I feel I have to be careful, because if I'm not careful, I will read into this whole thing an idea that I don't think is true. I don't think God is keeping score, but I am absolutely convinced that he notices what is happening in my life. And when I endure suffering, even though I did nothing to deserve that suffering, there is some kind of commendable attitude from God on that. It's bigger than I have a brain enough to unpack. But when, and there will be times, I think Peter kind of points that out, there are going to be times when I will not experience justice. I'll be punished somehow unjustly. And in verse 21, listen to this. To this you were called because Christ suffered for you, leaving you an example that you should follow in his steps. This is a very difficult reality. It's a reality that most American Christians are a little bit put off by, or a lot put off by, or one that we just simply avoid. When was the last time you heard a sermon, a very well preached sermon about the sufferings of Christ? Probably around Easter, somewhere in that season. And did the preacher tell you, oh, by the way, when Christ suffered, he was leaving you an example that you should follow in his steps? Now, that is a big deal. I years and years ago, well, now about 45 years ago, I read a most intriguing and engaging book written 100 years ago called In His Steps. And the premise of the book is, what would it be like to do things the way Jesus would do them? What would Jesus do bracelet? That came from the idea in that book, that we would follow in his steps. But here are some steps that almost nobody wants to follow in. The steps of his suffering. He had done nothing wrong, but he was executed. He was first punished, excruciating punishment, humiliated, and then he dragged the cross as far as he could before he collapsed when Joseph of Arimathea picked up the cross and carried it for him to Golgotha, where he was crucified and died. You want to follow in Jesus' footsteps? It's a great emotional idea, but when it comes down to that part of it, there's not very many of us that are ready to say, I'll follow you there. This is hard stuff. And my only application today is to confront in your own heart, your own mind, are you willing to follow in his steps when it comes to suffering? Gosh, we probably won't know until we're called on to suffer. Well, that's it. I've already exceeded my time when I was going to really try to cut it short today. My apologies. I hope I get to connect with you this way next time on Soul Care with Stevie Boy.